Good morning. Good morning. We're continuing our series on Portraits of the Past. And our last lesson, we saw how God plundered a cheater. And we are on the story of Jacob. And we are seeing how he interacts with his father-in-law, Laban, who really wants to just use him and benefit from God being with him. And we see how Laban is going to get his comeuppance. So we are seeing Jacob this time leaving Laban, loaded down with all of his possessions. And yes, he received them all from Laban, but God allowed it. God intercepted into Jacob's life and caused him to prosper and have these blessings. So we're starting today in chapter 31 in Genesis, and we're seeing what happens when Jacob flees from Laban's household. Now, Jacob, if he would have stayed in his own homeland, he would have had his own household. He would have never been under the tyranny of Laban, having to serve him as a servant, as an employee, even though he was his own father-in-law, and to earn the I want to say possession of his wives, because that's kind of what it was back then. But I think Jacob learns that these wives are not his possessions. They belong to him. They are his, as God gave them to him. But he sees this because he even consults with them before he decides to leave Laban's household. And that is where we left off. We left off with Laban in a field talking with his wives, saying that they he wants to go back to his homeland. God wants him to go back to the homeland. And he's discussing whether or not the wives will come with him, because he wants his wives to be in it with him. And he could just order them to go with him. But no, he consults with them and says, what do you want? And he works with them. This is not a headship. This is a priority of equality in these relationships that he has. Yes, he has two wives. Yes, God does not condone polygamy, but this is what he has and what he has to work with. So he is going ahead and treating them as equals, asking if they want to come along on the journey with him, because he's not leaving without them. So this is where we left off. In our last story, God plunders a cheater. And if you missed that video, that's on my private page and my ministry page. So in our last story, God plunders a cheater. We saw how Jacob acquired a flock as wages while working for Laban. So it says in the Bible, Jacob grew exceedingly prosperous and owned large flocks, female and male servants, and camels and donkeys. That's where we were last video. Now God wants Jacob to leave the land where he's working for Laban and go back to his native land. So he consults with his wives. Now this is not typical in this culture, to consult and see what your wife wants to do. But this is what his wives say. In verse 14 of chapter 31, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? So they're asking, do we have anything? Is our father going to give us anything? If he's not even going to give Jacob anything, he's not going to give his daughters anything either. So the daughters say this, not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. So all of that time that Jacob worked to have his wives, that profit that Laban made, he could have set aside for his daughters, but he didn't. He used it all up. He spent it on himself, or maybe he even gave it to his sons. And the daughters say, surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us as well as our children. So the wives see that the possessions that Jacob has, that he is going to leave Laban with, are from God. And they realize that that is theirs. That is, even though women were not allowed to hold any property in those days, they realize that if they go with Jacob, they are going to benefit with Jacob because of all the wealth that God allowed him to procure while he was in Laban's servitude. So the wives agree, and the wives say, so do whatever God has told you. Now, this may not be because they have an extreme faith in God. Maybe they just have an extreme faith in Jacob, and they have seen how dastardly their father has treated them in a culture where, even though women were inferior to men, these women were at least entitled some type of inheritance, and which they weren't going to receive. So in verse 17, Jacob puts his children and his wives on camels, and they took all that they accumulated while with Laban. And in verse 19, now unbeknownst to Laban, or to Jacob, Rachel steals her father's household gods. Now, I've seen interpretations that Rachel's really a pagan, and she stole the gods because she wants to have them on the journey because they represent protection and blessing in her father's household. But I think maybe she just wants to get back at her father for a lifetime of his greed and his abuse and his toxicity in their family. That's what I think Rachel is about with these household gods. I don't think she's stealing them so that she can worship them in Jacob's native land. I think she stole them because she knew that they were important to her father. And this was her last ditch effort to get back at him for what he did to her. Now, if you remember back several videos, Rachel was the promised wife to Jacob, and Laban tricked Jacob by giving Leah, her older sister, to Jacob first. So here is Rachel sitting by as the second wife with only one child, while Leah continues to have child after child after child. And you can listen to more about that in another video, in a previous video. So, but this is the status quo for Jacob here. We see that he is now going to do this with his wives. He is going to finally leave and come out from under the tyranny of Laban. So, but unbeknownst to Jacob, Rachel steals these household gods. So they're probably like little statues or little pieces of decorative things that Laban had in his tent. And so Laban would have noticed that these were missing. These would have been very important to him. So 3 days later, Laban finds out that Jacob had fled, and Laban goes after Jacob. And the reason he gives to Jacob is, Jacob, you have stolen my household gods. So when he finally catches up with Jacob, he says, why did you flee? I would have given you a great big banquet. I would have made a wonderful sending off ceremony for you. I would have been able to kiss my daughters and kiss my grandchildren and see you off. And you didn't let me do that. And second of all, you stole my household gods. So Jacob knows nothing about Rachel going ahead and stealing these statues or tokens or whatever Laban had. But Laban says, what have you done? So Jacob has his turn to retort and says, I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. See for yourself whether there's anything of yours with me. And so at that, Laban goes and searches through all the tents. Laban searches through Jacob's tent and Leah's tent and the servant's tent. And now finally he goes into Rachel's tent, and Rachel has those household gods hidden in her camel saddle, and she's sitting on it in her tent. And so, of course, Laban never finds the household gods. So Jacob is angry and says, how have I wronged you that you have hunted me down? You have searched through all of my goods. What have you found that belongs to you? And he goes on and he tells Laban the whole sad story. He says, I worked for you for 20 years. Your animals have never miscarried. Anything that was stolen, I replaced it out of my own pay. It was hard work and it was tiring work. And I worked 14 years for the wives and 6 years for my flocks. And he says, my wages were changed 10 times. So that shows you what kind of a cheat Laban is. So when he gets into that story, you actually see what Laban was doing all that time to Jacob. We don't hear him complaining throughout the whole time, but we hear the whole story now. And he says this in the presence of all Laban's relatives. So he shows that proof that his reputation is still intact. And as he leaves Laban's land, he is leaving with no debt to pay, no debt to pay at all, leaving on clear ground that he is absolutely leaving with what is his and nothing that is Laban's. But Laban speaks anyway and says, but those are my daughters, and those children are my grandchildren, and the flocks that you have are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. Laban still doesn't get it, that he worked for those wives, and those wives willingly went with him. So they are his wives. They may still be his daughters, but they are his wives. And those children that are his grandchildren, those are Jacob's children who are going to become the 12 tribes of Israel. They are Jacob's children. And the flocks, he worked for those flocks as wages. So none of that actually is Laban. So we see the distorted view of this man that is the head of this household, this dictatorship of a household that is run in this culture, that he believes that he still owns his daughters. He believes those grandchildren are his possession, and the flocks who he gave in payment are still his. So this is what we see with Laban. He makes a fool out of himself, trying to convince Jacob that he is wrong. So this is what he decides to do. He decides that he is going to make Jacob look like the bad guy and say, I want to make a treaty with you, a non-aggression pact, so that you will not cross this line and harm me, and I will not cross this line and harm you. And so that's what they do. In their culture, in their practice, they did this by stacking stones and making a memorial, just like you would make a memorial for any person today. We see stones, we see headstones, we see different types of grottos, types of things like that. So they took the stones and they made a memorial there. And Laban says, this heap is a witness between you and me today. If you mistreat my daughters, or you take any other wives beside my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me. So this pile of stone is going to be a memorial that at that place and at that time, Laban and Jacob made a treaty that they wouldn't harm each other, that they would go their separate ways, and that they would do the right thing. So Jacob offered a sacrifice there and invited his relatives to a meal. This becomes a custom. This becomes a custom of having the meal, giving a sacrifice, and in those days and in that time, this is how they appealed to a covenant. It was a sacrifice, and then there was a meal together, showing their camaraderie, showing peace. So this is a treaty for peace. So the next day, Laban kisses his daughters and his grandchildren and goes home. And with that, he allows Jacob to journey on. And just when we finally see some peace with Jacob and Laban, we are going to notice that as he travels toward his homeland, he is getting closer and closer to Esau, his brother, who he had wronged, and he is starting to make preparations to meet Esau. But before he meets Esau, I love this part of the story. God never lets us down. He shows us his compassion. He shows us his protection. He shows us his blessing. And in the beginning of chapter 32, on the way, the angels of God met Jacob. Now, these might be the same angels that he met in Bethel on the way to Laban's house. So when he leaves Laban, there is the angels again, a sign of protection that no harm will come to Jacob, God's chosen man. So the angels, the angels are messengers, and we see in dreams, and they are also sent to a person for a time of protection. So God is protecting Jacob on his journey back home. God is keeping his promise he made to Jacob at Bethel. And this is the promise from Genesis 28:15. I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. And that, I believe, is a promise for us also. God saying, I am with you, I will protect you, I will bless you, and I will give you what I have promised you. And if you're not sure what he's promised, you just open that Bible. It's filled with the promises of God. I want you to have a wonderful, wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.